Hello everyone, I'm Kibin Alleyne and today is Tuesday, May 23rd. You're now watching Open, a program bringing the Bronx and New York City straight to you. Don't forget to stay connected with us via social media at BronxNet TV. For many animal lovers, adopting a pet is a special experience. However, some people are being denied that moment. Those turning to the Humane Society of New York and Animal Care Center are met with several challenges and closed doors when looking to adopt. This longtime issue has raised concerns amongst animal rights activists like Donny Moss, who now joins me to discuss.
Dr. Hirschberg! This is the only animal shelter in New York that continues to use COVID as an excuse to keep the building closed to adopters.
They are still not allowing anyone in the building to see the animals, to adopt them.
These dogs should not be kept in a cage. They should have the opportunity to have a family.
When my cat died a year and a half ago, I was anxious to get another cat. The first place I contacted was the Humane Society. When I asked them about adopting, they said, we'll get back to you. And they hung up the phone. I never heard back from them again.
So many people have stopped to say that they've actually gone to breeders because they haven't heard back.
Locked in cages round the clock!
Lies, excuses, what a crop!
They're supposed to find a home for these animals that they waiting for such a long time. I think since the pandemic, so it's like 3 years. It's way too long.
It's been 3 years since you closed this building to adopters, Dr. Schmid. What kind of veterinarian turns a blind eye to animal cruelty? Lauren Kostler, don't you care?
Cats and dogs are in despair!
They're stuck in their cages indefinitely while you continue to collect money off unsuspecting donors who believe that you're facilitating adoptions in earnest.
We now welcome Donny Moss. Donny, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So can you first just explain what we, saw in that video?
Yeah, sure. So when I learned that animals were being warehoused at the Humane Society of New York, which is this large, wealthy shelter in a busy residential neighborhood, I was appalled. And before I did anything about it, I did my own research to corroborate whistleblower allegations. We were initially contacted by a whistleblower who informed us that animals were being warehoused, that adoptions had come to a virtual standstill in early 2020, and that the building was closed to the public under false pretenses. They were claiming to be closed this was in 2021 when I was contacted by a whistleblower. They were claiming in mid-2021 to be closed due to COVID, but what the whistleblower said was that they were actually closed because of violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they couldn't reopen unless they made the building wheelchair accessible. And so they were continuing to use COVID as an excuse to keep the building closed, and they had no plan to ever renovate the building. They were just going to keep the building closed to the public indefinitely. So I spent a couple of months corroborating these allegations before turning to protest. And what we found is that dozens of people were submitting adoption applications and weren't hearing back. And that there were, in fact, animals in the shelter who had been there for years and still are.
Well, I definitely thank you so much for sharing, a little bit about that clip. I want to talk a little bit more about your organization just in general. Can you talk about Their Turn?
So Their Turn is a grassroots animal rights organization in New York City. So we organize campaigns like what you just saw. This campaign is calling on the Humane Society of New York to send their animals to shelters that are open. And we have a website where we report on animal rights news. Much of what we report on is the campaigns that we work on locally in New York City, whether it's a campaign I'm organizing or campaigns that other advocates are organizing, like a fur-free NYC campaign or a campaign to get schools to introduce more plant-based foods.
Now, I want to talk about, your most recent effort, which is, the adoption process at the Humane Society of New York. For many people, adoption seemed like the safest and, the most welcoming thing for many animal lovers. Can you just talk about the moment where that kind of turned? I mean, not saying that it's not good to adopt. Of course, it's still good to adopt. But for this specific location, the Humane Society of New York, can you talk a little bit more about, where that turned?
Sure. So for many years, the Humane Society of New York, for decades, was open to the public. People could come in off the street, fill out an adoption application, and go into the adoption center and meet the animals and find a match. Well, that all changed in early 2020 when they closed their doors to the public. And to be fair, at the time, everyone closed their doors to the public because of COVID. The difference between this shelter and other shelters and other businesses is that they never reopened. And so people really had no way of meeting the animals, right? Like, for instance, if you want to adopt a cat, they can't bring cats out onto the street, onto busy 59th Street in Midtown Manhattan. You need to enter the building and meet the cats and get to know the cats. And there was no way of doing that. So they were pretending to be facilitating adoptions as they always had, but we knew, because many of us submitted applications, that they simply weren't responding. And that what the whistleblower said was true, that they were warehousing these animals instead of sending them to forever homes or to foster homes.
Now, can you talk about the term warehousing? That's the first time that I, heard this term. What does it mean to warehouse animals or cats and dogs?
Sure. So warehousing means that, people surrender their animals, or in the case of this particular shelter, they unfortunately take in dogs from a breeder and then give that breeder free vet care, which is horrible because in a sense, it's behaving like a pet store that's masquerading as a shelter. But that's an aside. And so they have these animals who are in the shelter, however they got there, and they're just keeping them there instead of doing what shelters should be doing, which is to triage them when they come in, get them whatever medical care they might need, whatever behavioral therapy they might need, and then get them into forever homes or to foster homes, because keeping them in a cage for months, or in the case of this shelter, years, is detrimental to their mental health and to their physical health, and it's just horribly inhumane. We know of animals who have been living in this shelter, cats and dogs, since at least 2018. Imagine being kept in a cage for 5 years. Yeah, they might let you out for a walk or for a few minutes each day, for some socialization, but basically you're living in a cage. You would go insane. And that is assuredly what's happening to some of the animals who've been stuck in these cages.
Now, is it normal, because I understand that, at the Humane Society of New York, that sometimes adoptions happen only about like once a week, if they do happen. Is that the norm in most adoption centers?
Not at all. This adoption center in particular, the Humane Society of New York, takes in several $1 million a year in donations from New Yorkers who believe that they're supporting a bona fide adoption center that's sending animals home every day and taking in surrenders every day. A shelter of this size, on their tax forms, they claim to have between 125 and 175 animals in the shelter at any given time. A shelter of that size, and with the amount of resources that it has in a centrally located residential neighborhood, should be doing adoptions every day of the week. That's their mission. So the thought that they're only doing one a week, and by their own admission, it's abominable. And as an aside, I'm not even sure I believe their numbers. I think it could be less than that.
Oh, wow. Now, I want to talk a little bit. I know that in an interview with Pix 11, the Humane Society says, of course, that the pandemic slowed things down, but that they were also preferring to carefully look through applications. What are your thoughts on that?
Two things. First of all, the pandemic should have sped things up because people were working from home. There was a desperate desire by so many people to adopt an animal during the pandemic because they would be working at home for an unspecified amount of time in the future. So in the case of this shelter, adoption slowed dramatically, which is the opposite of what should have happened. And so they're now saying, as on Pix 11 News, they said that they've changed their process. In the past, as I mentioned, people could come in off the street, right, fill out an adoption application, meet the animals, and adopt. Well, now they're saying to the public that they need to have an approved application before they'll let anyone into the building. Well, how do you approve an application before you've met the applicant? How do you approve an application before the applicant has even met any of the animals? An adoption center has to be open to adopters, and all the other shelters are.
And is this an issue with just animal adoption centers in general, or is this unique to the Humane Society of New York?
No, this is unique to the Humane Society of New York. Shelters are, by and large, desperate to find good adopters who want to take animals home and give them a forever home and empty that cage so that the shelter can bring in another animal who's been surrendered or found on the street. And so this is very unusual. They call themselves a no-kill shelter, and that might sound good in theory, but when they're not allowing new animals to come in because they don't have empty cages because they're filled with animals who've been stuck there, then those animals end up going to a kill shelter.
Now, what can people watching who love animals, and even I think that like there's a spectrum, right, of people who care about animals. What can everybody do who's watching to say like, hey, we want something to be done about this, and we want better for those animals.
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, my social media handle is at their turn, and we've posted dozens of viral videos about this campaign. Some of the videos have, on TikTok have millions of views, and so, or in combination. And so share the videos on Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter, on Facebook. And there's a campaign page on Facebook for this effort. It's called Humane Society of New York, Stop Warehousing Animals. And on that page, we put action items. The one final thing that I would say is that what we're asking for is fair. This building continues to be a fortress. It's under construction now. They are renovating the building now to make it ADA compliant because we pointed out that they can't stay closed if they're going to run an adoption center. So they caved into pressure. They're making the building accessible. In the meantime, it's a construction site. It's loud. It's messy. We just want them to send the animals who are there now to foster homes. They don't have to live in a cage and aren't subjected to a loud and messy renovation.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because I wanted to touch on, how are the animals dealing, kind of living in these type of situations?
Well, we're not there, but studies show that animals who are forced to live in cages for long periods of time are subjected to, psychological and stress and also, physical ailments. I mean, it's not healthy to keep an animal in a cage immobilized for 23 and a half hours a day. Those animals need to be in loving homes where they can jump on people's laps and sleep in bed and play and fetch a ball and get walked. And that's not happening here. They're being warehoused. They need to be in forever loving homes.
Well, Donny, thank you so much for joining us and having this discussion.
Thanks for having me.
To follow along or help this organization fight to protect these animals, please go to their website at www.theirturn.net. Don't go away. We'll be back with more Open right after this.